For donations, I ask that you donate $1 per video. Thank you. Lucius ran on top of the rooftops of his city, the city of Escatera, scaling buildings and jumping extreme distances to reach his destination, his slanted sword on his back. It was the dead of night, but with his vision he could see into the darkness with the few street lamps, which had lit his path. His light leather hooded jacket covering most of his body and draping over his pants and boots. He was in search of the blood bank, which had stood for a century thus far, where they collected human blood for medical purposes. He knew someone there who gave him enough to feed on for a week at a time, in secret as he needed to feed, for he was not of this world any longer. It had been only a few weeks since he had changed into what he was now, and then accepted into an order as ancient as time, an order that took in vampire and human alike. Somehow, he thought, despite his curse, it had saved him from taking the lives of many innocents, and he would not forget their sacrifice in doing so, as he had killed one of them, a man named Gregory, a young man. It saddened Lucius, who was about 30, to think of it, actually, surprisingly, but nonetheless he continued to make his way towards the blood bank, where he would feast on his next meal, if you could call it a feast, as the blood was stale and not at all very good. Still, he gladly drank it so as to avoid the casualty of another man or woman on this dark, dreary night. He descended from a tall tower attached to a larger building that happened to be a church, an old Catholic church that was holding midnight mass, avoiding the crowds of people. All cloaked in black coats with candlelight in hand, he ascended the blood bank and climbed into the third-story window furthest the church, his usual spot for receiving blood pouches. When he arrived, Lucy was there to greet him, as she normally did. "Hello," she greeted him, smiling. She was a tallish blonde woman with light blue eyes and a beautiful smile, a part of the order but never vampire. "Hello, Lucy," Lucius said back to her in an expensive accent, with a smile revealed his large canines. Lucy, however, was never afraid of these vampires. They were the good kind, the few who could or would curb their instincts, and who helped to eradicate their more bloodthirsty brethren. Lucius had sworn his life to the order, and they had protected him, given him means to seek blood elsewhere, rather than directly from humankind, and so he was grateful and not at all tempted to feast upon anyone as sweet as Lucy. Though he was tempted by it, indeed he was. "This curse," Lucius said, shaking his head and putting a hand to his temple. "Is there any way to be rid of it?" "We've already told you, Lucius," she said. "Once bitten by a vampire, there's no way of turning back into a human. None that we know of, anyhow." Lucius griped, but nonetheless took the 6 leather blood pouches that she offered and put them into his satchel. They didn't give him much, but it was enough, he supposed. As he prepared to leave, Lucy cautioned him about midnight mass at the church across the road, but Lucius informed her that he was already aware of it, and would avoid it on his way back to Bry's castle, the castle where he lived with other vampires of the order. Humans rarely visited. In fact, most of the order in the city weren't human any longer, as there had been an outbreak of vampirism not long ago, perhaps a century ago, and the city dwellers were all too aware of it. Lucius had to remain hidden from sight, and so he traveled cautiously over the church after leaving the blood bank, where he remained staring down at them for a time, wondering what it was they were feeling as they worshipped their goddess, the goddess of heaven and earth, Eva, she was called. Lucius had no disdain for her, but she seemed like a kind goddess if you were one of them, he thought. All throughout the night, they sang their holy praises, and Lucius, feeling melancholic that night, sat down on the roof of the church in utter darkness and listened with some joy and hesitation. He wished he could worship with them. After a few more moments, Lucius stood and traveled across the rooftops of the buildings of Escatera to Castle Bry. When he arrived, he knocked on the front door, and 2 vampires let him in, George and Dominic. He greeted them, and they him, and then simply passed on through to the other side, where he was protected from outside interference. There were a few humans in the castle this night, but for the most part, the city dwellers thought the castle abandoned, or simply did not care, or were too afraid to investigate its autonomy. When he entered the main hall, extravagant as ever, maybe 20 vampires sitting and drinking, their eyes glowing in the dimness. He was approached by another woman, not a human, and asked a simple question. "Where have you been?" she snarled and nagged, or Lucius found it annoying anyhow. It was his partner, Laura, who seemed concerned to say the least. "Blood bank," he muttered, showing her the satchel he carried the blood pouches in. 6 pouches, not very much. "Oh," she said, "and here I thought you were taking innocents." She leaned in to kiss him, jokingly, and each of them kissed for a moment. "Shall we go upstairs?" she asked. Lucius removed his hood and somewhat hesitantly replied, "Let's," and the two left to go to their bedroom for the night. When they arrived, however, something was wrong. Lucius looked out the window, which was open. "Did you leave this open?" he asked Laura. "No," she said bluntly. Lucius looked around the room and closed the window. "What is it, my love?" Laura cooed. "Nothing," Lucius replied, removing the long slanted sword from his back and placing it on the chair in the corner of the room. And with a smile as he began to kiss her, said, "Nothing at all."